I wanted to say a few words about the correlation between spiritual and biological evolution. In fact, I view the two as inseparable. And I believe that the general overview I'm about to offer is in harmony with the ancient and universal teaching of the esoteric mystery traditions. My goal is not to get bogged down with the devil in the details, where the major traditions diverge, but to paint a big picture with broad brushstrokes. Aside from backward religious fundamentalists who reject scientific knowledge, I trust that most modern people have a general understanding of biological evolution. My only serious contention with the scientific theory of evolution is that I do not consider it to be a purely random process. My view is that the process of biological evolution is driven by the impulse of spirit toward self-actualization. But unlike Abrahamic creationists, I don't necessarily view this as a conscious process. To say that a process is the result of intelligence, or mind, does not imply that it's the result of conscious intelligence, or conscious mind. It could equally be the result of unconsciousness. It's a mistake to think of unconsciousness as synonymous with unintelligence. You understand that when you dream, your dreams are the creation of your unconscious mind. Leaving aside instances of lucid dreaming, you do not consciously create your dreams. But dreams do not appear to be purely random. There are, of course, materialistic scientists who would like to convince you that your dreams are the result of random chemical and electrical activity in your brain. These are the same materialistic scientists who would like to convince you that the universe is the result of random, blind, chemical, and physical processes. But to anyone who seriously examines the content of dreams, although there are absurd elements, it's clear that dreams have meaning. They are intelligible. They tell a story. They reflect fears and desires. They are clearly the product of intelligence, even if they're not the product of conscious intelligence. And to me, as well as to many other more enlightened minds, it's clear that this is true of the universe as well, and is especially true of biological processes within the universe. Natural selection is an explanation that only addresses appearances, but fails to look beneath the surface. It has exactly the same fallacy as behaviorism. Behaviorism ignores inner mental states and focuses exclusively on external systems of reward and punishment as an explanation for behavior. Behaviorism views human behavior as being conditioned by external environmental factors rather than by internal mental factors. In the same way, materialistic biologists view evolution as being guided by external environmental factors rather than by internal mental factors. Both theories reflect exactly the same spiritual blindness. A person who has been healed of their spiritual blindness can see the ignorance of materialistic biologists and psychologists, and it's very easy to expose their ignorance for what it is. As someone who has studied psychology, I'm familiar with the principles of classical and operant conditioning, and I certainly don't deny that positive and negative reinforcements shape the behavior of humans and other animals. They do. And in the same way, I agree that natural selection favors genetic mutations and adaptations that are advantageous in terms of survival and reproduction. But this simply begs the question, why is human behavior shaped by rewards and punishments? It is an inner state of desire that explains why humans and other animals engage in behaviors which they expect will help them achieve a desired end. If internal states of desire, fear, and intentionality did not exist, then classical and operant conditioning would be ineffective. And in the same way, unless there is some inner principle within biological organisms, environmental pressures are irrelevant. Again, I don't claim that this inner principle is conscious, necessarily. It doesn't have to be. It is largely unconscious, especially in the early stages, But human behavior is not like a computer program, and humans are not robots that are programmed by their external environment. And biological systems are not random accidents. Evolutionists like Daniel Dennett have compared natural selection to a series of coin tosses. To paraphrase his analogy from the book Darwin's Dangerous Idea, imagine taking a handful of quarters and throwing them into the air. When they land, some will land heads and others will land tails. This is purely due to probability. Now imagine that you take all the coins that land heads up for the next toss and discard all the ones that landed tails down. You throw them, and again, some land heads and others land tails. Once more, you discard those that land tails and gather those that land heads up for the next toss. After several tosses, you're left with just a couple of quarters that landed heads up every time. And Dennett makes the point that someone who doesn't understand probability will marvel at the highly improbable event of these quarters landing heads up several times in a row. This person may even naively assume that the improbability of this occurring is evidence of supernatural intervention, or of some unseen influence. But of course, if you understand probability, you understand that this outcome was virtually inevitable. And I think that in many ways, this is a fair analogy. But the analogy cuts off its own legs, in my opinion. Because although randomness is involved in the experiment itself is the result of intelligence and intention. Daniel Dennett mentally created this hypothetical experiment in order to make a specific point, and he purposefully designed an experiment that would have an outcome which would support his argument. And it isn't purely the result of chance that coins that land heads up are chosen rather than coins that land tails up. He may have picked heads arbitrarily, but this still represents a mental choice. So his analogy actually supports my position rather than his, so I thank him for making my point for me, as materialists like him so often ignorantly do. In light of this meta-analogy, let me offer an alternative hypothesis. In the meta-analogy, the person who designs the experiment is like the universal mind. The cosmic experiment of the universe, although designed to include elements of randomness, is created with a purpose in mind. And the ultimate outcome of the experiment is known ahead of time, precisely because of mathematical laws of probability. The odds are additionally stacked in favor of this outcome by the fact that each of the coins embodies the will of the experimenter. The coins are aware that they will be chosen or cast aside on the basis of whether they land heads or tails. And although many of them fail to do so, each of them wills itself to land heads up. The simplest life forms may not actually have a survival instinct, but I believe they do. But the impulse manifests more strongly in more advanced life forms. As human beings, we are most certainly consciously aware of our own mortality. Our conscious intention to survive and pass on our genes guides our behavior. In fact, my position is that the source of this will to become is contained within the genes themselves. Richard Dawkins essentially argues this position for me in his book, The Selfish Gene. But like Dennett, he fails to perceive the deeper truth that lies behind his superficial insight. Just as members of a species can be thought of as a part of one collective organism, every species of animal and plant life can be thought of as a part of an even larger collective organism. And virtually every esoteric tradition teaches this principle of the unity of life. You could think of it as a kind of tree of life. All living creatures are a part of that tree. And evolutionists often use a diagram that resembles a tree to show how different species are related. But whatever flows outward toward the branches of a tree comes from the trunk. If individuals within a species group desire to survive and pass on their genes, then this is a manifestation of the will of the species itself. And this, in turn, is a manifestation of the will which originates from deep within the roots of the tree of life itself. And life itself arises as a manifestation of the universe itself. It is impossible for something to emerge from a thing unless it is already contained within that thing. Intelligence, intentionality, and consciousness arise in living organisms because life itself is a manifestation of the intelligence, intentionality, and consciousness, which are aspects of the eternal nature of the universe itself. And biological life arises within the universe because the universe itself is a manifestation of the eternal life of the universal mind. Anyone who rejects this hypothesis is left to explain how the universe emerged from nothing, how life emerged from lifelessness, and how mind emerged from non-mental processes. I can sympathize with those who find my hypothesis unbelievable and seemingly improbable, but the alternative hypothesis is absolutely impossible. And as Sherlock Holmes famously said, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Once you accept the truth that the universe is mind-generated and is the manifestation of intention, questions regarding the purpose of the universe and the meaning of life arise. If you reject this truth, then such questions are nonsensical. And so I call this truth the philosopher's stone. It is the cornerstone of the philosophical edifice. Without it, the entire building crumbles. And it is the stone that the builders of the tower of materialistic science have rejected. They are the fools who build their house on sand. True philosophers are the wise men who build their house on the rock. And this rock, this truth, is ultimately grounded in the knowledge of the true self, in which eternal life is found. This is the meaning of the phrase, know thyself. To know yourself, or to know your true self, is to discover your true will, which is the secret to understanding the hidden meaning and purpose of life and the universe. In fact, it is the hidden meaning and purpose of life and the universe. The universe and life arise from the desire of the universal mind for self-knowledge. This is all part of a cosmic process by which unconsciousness is transmuted into consciousness. In much the same way that your dreams, as an individual, serve the function of bringing content from your subconscious mind into conscious awareness, the cosmic dream serves to bring the universal mind into a state of conscious self-knowledge. But I don't say that this is a conscious act in the beginning. Again, you don't consciously generate your personal dreams. In the same way, I deny that the universal mind consciously generates the universe. Rather, the material universe is a manifestation of the universal mind's unconscious desire to become self-conscious. It enters into the material universe in order to take part in this process. And this is the deeper meaning of the mystical teaching that desire is the cause of material attachment. A shallow interpretation of this teaching is that it is our carnal desires, or the desires of the flesh, that cause us to cling to material bodies and reincarnate into this world of suffering. But the deeper meaning is that ultimately, it is the desire of our true divine will for self-knowledge that keeps us in the cycle of death and rebirth, because only through this cycle of death and rebirth can we gain the self-knowledge we seek. And it's only then that we can leave. Of course, we can also choose to stay in order to serve as guides, and some of us do. If you think of sin as ignorance of your true self, and if you think of death as the illusion of separation from your true self, then you will understand the mystical significance of Paul's statement in Romans 6:23 that the wages of sin is death. If you also consider that hell is the material universe, then you will understand the Christian teaching that sinners go to hell when they die. Taken literally, the idea that a loving God would create hell seems shocking and appalling, but this myth contains a profound mystery. Myths such as this emerge from the collective unconscious, in the same way that dreams emerge from the personal unconscious, and in the same way the universe emerges from the cosmic unconscious. Often, the most frightening and confusing dreams are the ones which come from very deep within our unconscious psyche. For whatever reason, we're afraid to face this repressed content. So when it begins to emerge, it appears first as frightening images. Because we are not yet ready to face it and see it clearly, our unconscious must reveal it to us in confusing images. Over the course of many dreams, the repressed content emerges gradually. As the unconscious content gradually emerges, we become slowly desensitized to it, and we become less afraid. As our fears subside, the symbols become progressively less frightening and confusing. Eventually, by degrees, we become conscious of the repressed content. And similarly, the ancient mystery schools incorporated myths and symbols which were often very shocking and disturbing. This was because, at the lower degrees, the initiate was not yet sufficiently prepared to receive the secret teachings. The idea was that as the initiate passed through the degrees, the secrets of the order would be presented to him in increasingly plain language and symbols. Now, what if we think of each incarnation as a kind of dream? Across many lifetimes, just as across many dreams, we gradually become more conscious of that which has been hidden. This is the process of spiritual evolution. So how does this relate to biological evolution? Well, to borrow a metaphor from Jesus, you can't put new wine into old wineskins. The wine is the spirit. The wineskin is the body. As the soul evolves, it passes from the mineral level to the plant level to the animal level and then to the human level. So although life is one, it's also divided into grades. An insect and a human are equal in the sense that they're both manifestations of the same divine essence, but they're unequal in the sense that their souls are presently at different stages in their spiritual evolution. Correspondingly, there are clearly biological differences between the insect and the human. Two humans may be at different stages in their spiritual evolution, but they are much closer to one another than they are to the insect. I'm saying that biological evolution and spiritual evolution are extremely closely correlated. And this will make many people deeply uncomfortable, because if we bring up the topic of biological differences, it's difficult to avoid the topic of race. Some people will ask me, if there's a connection between biological evolution and spiritual evolution, and if there are biological differences between the different races, does that mean that you believe that one race is spiritually superior? First of all, I have to say that I am a race realist. I consider it to be an undeniable fact that biological differences exist between the races. Second, I do believe that biological evolution mirrors spiritual evolution. So yes, I do believe that spiritual differences, as well as biological differences, exist between the races. But just as I deny that one race is biologically superior to another, I deny that one race is spiritually superior to another. Difference does not automatically imply superiority. It's possible to have two branches on a tree without one being higher than the other. They simply grow in different directions. But all branches grow from the same seed toward the same sun. This applies to different species as well as to different races for that matter. The fourth Star Trek film raises the interesting question of whether an alien race might consider whales rather than humans to be the most highly evolved form of life on the planet. But I do believe that men and women of every race can become enlightened. But I'm not surprised to see that different racial and subracial groups seem to practice different forms of spirituality. And I believe that there are differences in the myths, symbols, and rituals in the religious traditions that are created or adopted by different racial groups and subracial groups. Although there are universal archetypes that they all seem to share, these universal archetypes seem to express themselves in ways that are unique to each. Even though Buddhism has spread from India to China to Japan, as well as to other places, Japanese Buddhism isn't exactly the same as Chinese Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism. And speaking of Tibetan Buddhism, I find it interesting that the Tibetans have always searched for the next reincarnation of the Dalai Lama in Tibet, among the Tibetan people. They never seem to have considered the possibility that the Dalai Lama would reincarnate as a white man in Sweden, or as a black woman in sub-Saharan Africa. Pythagoras claims to recall 4 previous incarnations. In all of them, he was a man of the same racial type from the same general geographic area. In the same way that 2 parents of the same race will produce offspring of the same race, a soul seems to have a tendency to reincarnate into a body of the same race as its former body. Although it's politically correct these days to say that Pythagoras might reincarnate as a black woman, it seems far more likely that he would look fairly similar to the way he looked in his previous incarnation. The Dalai Lama has apparently said that this will be his final incarnation, but if he did return, I suspect he would probably return as an Asian man again. I'm not convinced that this is always the case, but I do not believe that souls arbitrarily reincarnate as different races and genders simply to satisfy the diversity quotas of modern progressives and social justice warriors. And again, I think this simply has to do with the relationship between biological and spiritual evolution. In many ways, I believe the body is the physical image of the soul. Although many within the Gnostic tradition especially tend to think of mind and body in dualistic terms, and although I speak of mind and body in dualistic terms sometimes too, many traditions emphasize the unity of body and mind. The Chinese, the Hindus, and the Greeks all developed systems of physiognomy. Among these ancient cultures, and especially within their mystery schools, it was believed that you could know a person's character and destiny by studying the physical features of their face. I'm not simply talking about reading facial expressions. I'm talking about reading facial features. Pythagoras is said to have practiced face reading, and I've studied face reading myself, and have even been hired on multiple occasions to do it professionally. I've often asked people to rate the accuracy of my readings, and most of them rated my readings as at least 80 or 90% accurate. This may not mean that face reading is less than 100% accurate. It may simply mean that I haven't completely mastered the art of face reading. Of course, when studying faces, it's difficult to ignore the fact that racial groups tend to have certain characteristic facial features. And many of the more modern books on the topic of face reading try to dismiss racial differences. The older books don't. And in general, I found the older books to be much more impressive. These days, of course, the idea that you can judge a person based on their physical appearance is taboo. But imagine if someone invented a camera that could take a picture of a person's soul. Would it be fair to judge them based on that picture? Well, what if that camera has already been invented? What if millions and millions of people already have one? What if it's just an ordinary camera that takes pictures of people's faces? What if a person's face is literally a photograph of their soul? If so, isn't it likely that when a person reincarnates, they might bear a slight resemblance to the person they were in their former life? If a boy is a spitting image of his great-grandfather, this may just be family resemblance, but it may also be more than that. I've read articles about children who apparently have memories from their former lives as their dead relatives, and if, as I suggest, there is a connection between biological and spiritual evolution, then it wouldn't be surprising if a soul's journey from one lifetime to the next often tends to follow a particular bloodline. A while back, in the semicircle, we were discussing a Sethian Gnostic text, and in the Sethian literature, you'll come across references to the generation of Seth, or the incorruptible race. The question came up whether this actually meant a race or lineage in the biological sense, or whether it referred to a kind of spiritual lineage. My answer is that the two are not mutually exclusive. In fact, the two may, in fact, be extremely difficult to separate. The idea that biological and spiritual evolution are intimately connected has many implications, which it would be impossible to fully explore in a single discussion. But I hope I've stimulated your mind, and I encourage you to spend some time contemplating this topic further on your own. Peace.